Hello, good afternoon. My name is Henry Chen, Managing Director of Summer Capital. Next up, we're going to discuss something that's very interesting and I think a problem and opportunity that has been driving the involvement and the development of the whole Web3 and the blockchain industry for the past few cycles. A problem that was discussed as early as in the Ethereum white paper, which is the scalability. Let me open today's panel discussion by introducing each of the panelists. If you may still introduce yourself and please share a few thoughts on what does scaling mean for you.
Okay, yeah, awesome. So hello everyone, my name is Taylor. I'm head of community at Dappos. And Dappos is an intent execution network, and basically what that means is we make dApps as user-friendly as Web2 or current mobile apps. So when it comes to Web3, it can get really complicated, so a lot of times I kind of bring it down to earth by making a bunch of analogies to how I see things. And so I was thinking earlier today about scalability and how that could relate to like the real world. And for example, coming up this summer is the Paris Olympics, right? Paris, France. And it's like, I think 100 years since they held the last Olympics. And if you look at it in the sense of athletes, an athlete 100 years ago is a lot different than an athlete is today. Athletes today are going to be much faster, much stronger. They're going to perform at a higher level, and because of the advancements that are around them, right? Because of sports nutrition, sports sciences, all the training. And I kind of look at scaling that way as Web3 progresses, each project is going to have to hop on board to the advancements and everything. If they're not increasing speed, if they're not lowering gas fees, you're going to get left behind. And so that's the way I look at scaling, and I'm excited to get into the topic today. And thanks for having me.
Hey everyone, Ed Roman, founder of Hack.Summit and co-founder of Hack VC. When I think about scalability, I think kind of one flavor of that is called horizontal scalability, and the basic idea behind that is as your transaction load increases, your system scales with that transaction load, so that there's kind of a linear relationship between those two parties, rather than kind of an exponential increase or a logarithmic increase that would occur in that case. So that's kind of how I think about scalability. And I will note that not all Web3 AI workloads truly need the levels of scalability that's being discussed among some of the more performant platforms these days. There are certain use cases like Web3 gaming that are fast performing, and they do have higher performance requirements, but those types of applications oftentimes can process most of their work off-chain rather than on-chain. And so, a lot of the like the mainstream use cases of Web3 actually can tolerate just a reasonable level of throughput and still function quite well.
Hey guys, this is Luke, founder of Web3MQ. We contribute to scaling in mostly two aspects, our team. So one is from the product aspect, we focus on middleware networks. So we help networks and other networks be able to connect to each other. Chakra is one of those use cases for Bitcoin to be both trustless and then fast and high UX. And then also, our team does a lot of open source collaborations and contributions with ecosystems. We've contributed and built the second generation consensus layer for Starknet's Moderator app chain stack. And we're also collaborating on the parallelization engine that powers that app chain stack. So both through open work and then middleware networks scaling.
Thanks for the introduction. Next up, maybe let me invite Ed to lead the first topic. As from investor perspective, Hack VC has been one of the most active investors investing in infrastructure companies that really address to the scaling problems across the different technologies and different aspects. But we also observed that in the past few years have been many layer ones, layer twos, app chains, and also we are in heated discussion on modular blockchain, which actually increases the development of new chains. So how do you look at this industry landscape based on what you have observed, the projects, and how do you think the industry will evolve down the road? Will there be consolidation, or do you think all these chains will have their own value?
That's a great question. I think what's been happening in Web3 is actually very similar to what happened in Web2 over the last 10, 15 years or so. So if you look at the history of Web2 began as a bunch of monolithic applications that ran on your server. So you would have, back in like the early 2000s, you would have this thing called a 3-tier architecture, where you'd have a web server, an application server, and a database. And that application server eventually merged with the web server, and that became just like one server, basically. And that stayed around for about 5 years or so. Then someone had this brilliant idea of, let's break up that big server into little pieces, and those things are called microservices. And these microservices are little functions of applications that interface with each other through these things called RESTful APIs. And that's a common kind of interface between these different little microservices. And we kind of realized over time that breaking up those monoliths into smaller components made your system more maintainable and more modular, and allowed you to pick and choose which services you wanted to. And it allowed the whole system to evolve in independent ways, rather than you having to update a whole monolithic application. So we see a similar trend here happening in Web3, where you have a modularity of what was originally the layer ones back in 2018. And back then, there was the same criticism, the same exact criticism, that there's too many layer ones. That was the criticism back in 2018, because back then, there was only one real application that required scalability, and that was called CryptoKitties. And CryptoKitties was, the first kind of NFT-like game that people wanted to use. And I remember in April of that year, CryptoKitties actually broke Ethereum. Like, Ethereum could not scale to handle CryptoKitties, and almost all the traffic in 1 month came from this one application. So if you were to look at the pitches of the layer ones back then, every one of them had the exact same go-to-market plan. Their go-to-market plan was, we're going to get CryptoKitties. That was the one customer they were all pursuing at the same time. It was kind of hilarious, actually, to hear them all pursuing the same customer. So we had this problem back then where there weren't enough applications of Web3, but there was a lot of infrastructure that was being built to chase those applications. So then the dilemma became, well, are there actually enough real-world applications of crypto to take advantage of this infrastructure? Or maybe, which is the more optimistic approach, which I personally subscribe to, is maybe there just wasn't enough infrastructure yet to inspire the developers out there to build those applications. And as we've seen since then, there's been a whole lot more applications than CryptoKitties. So, lesson learned here, basically the takeaway point is that in Web 2, no one really debates the fact that infrastructure in Web 2, databases, query systems, things like that, those are all very valuable products in Web 2, and they've been reinvented many times over the years. You had Hadoop MapReduce turn into Apache Spark, right? These are just old technologies wearing a funny new hat, basically. And the same thing has happened in Web 3, and I believe that as the applications come, that's going to serve the demand of that infrastructure.
Yeah, I think what you say is very interesting, because the best way to innovate and to push the infrastructure to upgrade is to have a bigger scale applications to test it or stress test it, as we observe in the DeFi summer, as we observe during the time where there was heated inscriptions, activities testing every different chains, and then people realize maybe a certain part of the module need to be upgraded. I would like to switch gear to from a builder and the founder perspective. Luke and Taylor, you have started your own projects trying to tackle the scalability problems, but you must face the question as well, when you see all these infrastructure being built, what value add can you provide to the end users, and how do you choose the different solutions available to you?
Yeah, I'll start off with this question. So when it comes to development, I'm not very technical, but I do want to address this. There's this one thing that is said across many different industries. It's, if it ain't broken, don't fix it, right? And I think in this industry, it doesn't necessarily, it's not very true in this industry, because in Web 3, Web 2 users are facing different problems than Web 3 users, right? So it's like, I might think a project is just perfect. I don't think there's anything that needs to be fixed. But in order to grow, you have to address those problems. And maybe the Web 3 problem is different than Web 2. Like a new Web 2 user, they'll look at, let's say, using a protocol, using a decentralized exchange, and they'll look at it and they're going to have completely different problems than somebody who's been in the industry since 2017, 2018. And so I think one way to address those problems is you always got to bring it back to user experience, right? Because with all the tech, all the advancements, everything that's happening so fast in this industry, every week there's this new buzzword, there's this new area that you have to learn about. but sometimes you got to slow down and think about what does a basic user want? What is their intention? How can they go from point A to point B in as minimal steps as possible? And at our project, Dappos, one way that we like to do that is, I think our bread and butter is our collaboration and integration with dApps and DEXs. GMX being one of our big partners, as everyone knows, GMX is based on the Arbitrum blockchain. But with our partnership and integration, we use our front-end SDK, and then we now give GMX users the ability to carry out all the same transactions as they would on Arbitrum, but now they have access to Polygon, Optimism, BNB, Ethereum. So I think at the end of the day, it's just providing the best user experience you can, giving users more options, and simplifying everything, because if I'm a new Web3 user, I want to go from A to B as quickly as possible. I don't really care or worry so much about what's happening on the back end. So user experience is important, don't forget about it.
Luke?
Yeah, so I think that question can somewhat be like dissected into two questions. You know, one is on the kind of the user side, adoption side. The other is like on the infra side, what are we doing to serve scalability? First question, I think, for us, we try to work with the users really closely. Now, how about Web3 at this point? There's still a lot of casino going on, a lot of speculation going on, and one of the hard needs for users is how can I speculate more quickly, right, with lower latency? That does become the user need for a lot of time, but the thing is, it does also build infrastructure that later on can be built towards, like, say, high-performance social that's decentralized and trustless. Like, before this, I was in Web 2, and we were building social around 2018, which was a time when you would really get mowed down into the ground by the big companies because of the way Web 2 infrastructure worked. So yeah, in that sense, I think it's going well. I think there's user adoption. Like, every cycle, I decided to enter Web3 full-time last cycle because I thought there was user adoption finally. So I'm still optimistic about that. And in terms of scaling, you know, what we're betting on, I think Ed was talking about, you know, how microservices evolved from the traditional web. One thing we think is really important is the modular trend. I think one pain point today with Web3 infra is people are rebuilding each other's wheels a lot, right? Each L1, each L2. It's really hard for Arbitrum to work with Optimism, right? Imagine that happening. It's not going to happen. But, you know, when you have DA layers and settlement layers and then different execution layers, that happens. So we do try to bet big on this trend. And so also, I guess for Chakra, we try to focus on the settlement layer. We think that's the core pain point that, you know, stops Bitcoin from being too valuable in terms of the L2, at least up until this point. And so really, yeah, building towards the modular trend. And then also, I guess, you know, L3s are kind of, there's a debate, you know, these past days about, do we really need L3s? Or is it just enough? I think L3s on verticals are kind of maybe going towards microservices too. You know, a service, a backend, somewhat like an AWS Lambda function, right? That serves like a particular application. I personally see a lot of need for that. So in terms of scalability, we're really excited about modularization that allows people to work together and not rebuild too many wheels. And then two, also kind of trends. Personally, I think L3s have their spot to serve vertical applications. So yeah, those are what we're bullish on around scaling.
Thank you. I think you touched upon two questions, two topics very interesting. One is the interoperability among the different chains, whether in the future they can join force, collaborate, share the ecosystems, and hence provide the best and the broadest user experience to users and developers. Two is actually we see a lot of build up on L2s and L3 from L1. Which leads to my next question, and I would like to invite Ed to answer first, which is, you know, we've all known there is an unbreakable trilemma among the scalability, security, and decentralization. And of course, in terms of blockchain-based ecosystem or Web3, decentralization is what we are aiming for. So there are different solutions to achieve decentralization and achieve scalability. However, that leads to people's question on, is one solution secure or decentralized enough in terms of building L2s and L3s? So, in your mind, is this unbreakable trilemma, you know, valid and is it solvable? how do you see the different L2s and L3s and other solutions that focus more on maybe execution, security, scalability, but have some questions on the decentralization?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very good question, and we debate this a lot internally at Hack VC. There are several partners at my firm that really believe in trustless kind of, or at least having very minimal trust assumptions between parties. For example, a good use case of this is bridging, cross-chain bridging. So, in the first half of 2023, we had about $500 million stolen in bridge hacks, right? So one could argue, well, security is pretty important, right? Like, we should probably be paying a little bit more attention to security when it comes to bridges. So if you look at all the bridges that are out there, right, some of them are trustless and decentralized, and some of them are centralized, right? And not really trustless. And like maybe a good example of this would be like Layer 0 with their original architecture was fairly centralized. Another good example of this would be Chainlink, which is also fairly centralized. And yet, for all the criticisms that these projects get for being centralized, they also happen to be the market leaders. They're number one in their categories, right? Why is that? Why are these centralized players number one? Well, maybe, when it comes to bridging, maybe, after you have enough customers using your bridge and you haven't been hacked in a while, and all the other bridges have been hacked, I think people follow the herd and they start to trust a centralized solution. So I think it really depends on the use case. If you look back in Web 2, Web 2 systems have been proprietary historically, and they've been relatively safe, when it comes to things like financial transactions. They haven't been perfect or anything, but the amount of hacks lost in DeFi transactions has been really eye-opening compared to Web 2 as of recently. And so I do believe that there is an argument for more centralized systems in certain use cases, because when you are publishing open source code, you're basically giving the criminals a roadmap to dig up the pot of gold, right? And so, I think really depends on the use case. Like for gaming use cases, for example, speed might be more important and scalability might be a little bit more important than security, right? So I think in the future what we'll see is an evolution towards app chains where you have vertical specific layer ones, and for example, like a Berachain is like a really great example of this. Berachain is a very kind of DeFi focused chain, right? I mean, there's other use cases of Berachain as well, but that's really the sweet spot for them, is very DeFi focused. And so we're starting to see kind of layer ones that are focused more on gaming and other use cases as well. And so I think we might even start to see that application specific specialization where they make different trade-offs between those elements of the trilemma.
Thank you. Speed is very important. It's very, very important for end users. So in terms of user experience and the UI UX, obviously Dappos is trying to build a smooth and seamless user experience as possible based on intent-based execution. So Taylor, can you talk more about Dappos and how, obviously in the UX perspective, it's very simple for users, but can you talk more about the infrastructure that supports this, especially how does that also help with scalability?
Of course, yeah. So like I mentioned earlier, in this industry, these buzzwords and these buzz areas come around, and projects adopt them based on what's happening. And I think back in, it feels like forever ago because this industry moves so fast, but back in last July around ECC, this whole idea of intent and the user's intention came into fruition. And basically as a project, we took it by storm because being solely focused on user experience, we find out that your average Web 2 user onboarding into Web 3, they really don't, like I mentioned earlier, they really don't care so much, or they probably don't need to worry about what's happening on the back end. So that's kind of where intent-centric comes in. And I always like to give analogies. And so when I think about intent-centric, I think about me going to a restaurant. Or like, why do I want to go to a restaurant? My main idea is I'm going to get a meal. My main worries are, it's like if the meal's going to be good, I'm going to be worrying about the price. But there's a lot that's actually going on in the restaurant behind the scenes, right? You've got your chefs, you've got your waitresses, you've got the whole finance team, you've got everything going on the back end. But me as a consumer, me as somebody who wants to eat at the restaurant, I want to get my meal, talk with friends, get a drink, and then I want to leave. And I think we kind of address that problem with intent-centric. For example, one use case is with our integration and collaboration with Banky. On Banky, you can do recursive staking, and normally Banky is based on Avalanche blockchain. And like I mentioned earlier, with our unified account at Dappos, you're now able to carry out the same transactions you would on Banky, but with the 8 or 9 chains that we support. But when it comes to recursive staking, normally you would go in and you would do one execution at a time, and each execution carries its own gas fees. But an example of intent is you're now able to carry out recursive staking with Banky powered by Dappos. You can do 5 executions at once, which only entitles you to one set of gas fees. So it's kind of like taking things that aren't necessary and batching them together, or putting them all in one place to where your new user doesn't have to worry, like I mentioned, about what's exactly happening on the back end. So.
All right. Thank you. I would like to go back to what Luke previously mentioned. So one question we talk about the trilemma issue, but the other question is the interoperability among the different chains. You built 2 projects, which actually one is about the communication layers that supports different chains. The other is actually a interoperable layer between the Bitcoin and the rollup, which is built on StockNet ecosystem for Chakra. Could you talk about why do you approach the scalability in 2 ways with these 2 projects, and what specific use case is that, and how do you see the communication among the different protocols or infrastructure can work on the long term?
Yeah, so I mean, Web3 MQ was kind of where we started when I just entered this industry, like slightly over a year ago. So kind of early in that sense. For Chakra, it's a bit more directed towards current needs. What we see around the BTC ecosystem is that, I mean, first of all, the reason for kind of building for anything for the BTC ecosystem is, I guess Ed just mentioned a big debate around trustlessness, right? That actually used to be the hardest question for me to answer back 12 months ago when I was first fishing in this industry. Like, do you need anything that's decentralized? Like, why at all, right? And trustlessness is one of those keywords, but I think at least currently I have an answer, which is trustlessness brings more trust and then also price. That's why Bitcoin is worth a lot. It's the most, at least like fair platform, right? Like POS, you could kind of argue it centralizes things a bit, but so people still trust Bitcoin a lot. Okay, it's kind of janky in terms of the programming environment, but in terms of decentralized trust, it's the best. And so that's the biggest pro with why people kind of want their hands on Bitcoin. But the problem with the Bitcoin chain is you don't have smart contracts like Ethereum. So it does become hard to connect things. And a lot of BTC L2s today are secured by multi-sigs, which is nice. Before the first project rugs and somebody loses like 10,000 Bitcoins, right? That's going to be horrible. That's going to be like a FTX moment. But so essentially, so in that sense, what we saw was this need for bridging these programmable environments along with that, slightly more traditional but still very secure chain. So in that sense, a lot of kind of we try to take settlement as a modularized layer itself. So there's a decentralized chain taking care of the key parts of settlement. Like say, for example, you can't really verify Stark proofs on the BTC chain itself. So it doesn't make that trustless on BTC automatically. But you can do that with a middleware chain in between that helps do that. It's not as good as BTC L1 itself. BTC L1 has over $1 trillion secured in that. So that's the level of economic security you can offer. Obviously for Chakra, the chain, when it's launched, there's going to be less secured amount. But still, we can have a level of trustlessness there. It's going to be slightly better than a multi-sig, right? I hope. And so that's kind of the key value we see, which is, I think in this industry, it's about, one, bridging UX, either via intense or high performance. And then also for things like Bitcoin and whatnot, it's about how do I bridge the trust? So that's kind of one thing we're really focusing on. And I think kind of having a settlement middleware chain might be kind of really key to unlocking some of that sweet $1 trillion value. Yeah.
Thanks. I like the way how you mentioned you have actually thought about the economics of different solutions and options. And I think, obviously from investor perspective, that's sometimes often overlooked when we talk about the whole Web3 industry and the tokenomics design. At the end of the day, every project is a business, and it's backed by investors, it's backed by different stakeholders. Maybe, Ed, you can comment on the economics or business model for the different infrastructures that build on or that helps scalability. Do you see there is discussion or focus on, economics model within different infrastructure solutions? And do you think we're at a stage where the new infra actually just makes sense from either cost or revenue perspective as a project?
Yeah, of course. I mean, to be brief here, there has not been a strict correlation between the value of infrastructure and the revenue generated by that infrastructure, at least historically. And the reason for that is there hasn't been a valuation framework that you can program and produce a consistent output for compared to Web 2. Like if you look at Web 2, an enterprise SaaS company might get a 6x ARR multiple on public markets, right? Those multiples do not exist for Web 3. It's all speculative based on investors' perceptions and hopes for the future. And I think to be fair to Web 2, there are valuations in Web 2 that are also uncorrelated to revenue, such as artificial intelligence, right? Why is Mistral AI worth $1 billion right now, despite having probably very little, if any, revenue? So, these kind of bubble valuations happen in early markets, so it's not unexpected. Now, when it comes to infrastructure, there's been a movement towards modularity, and part of that movement has been decentralizing the sequencer and having the sequencer for the blockchain come from kind of a third party, and for that itself to be decentralized. That way there's no single point of failure, so it reduces the centralization risk of these networks. Now, historically, sequencers have captured fees, and that's where some of the economic value accrues in Web 3. So there is a fundamental tension. Like if you are a provider today of a platform that has a centralized sequencer, do you really want to partner with a third party that offers a decentralized sequencer to replace your centralized sequencer? Well, if you do that, you have what's called channel conflict, meaning you're basically giving up some of your revenue to that third party. So what we might start to see are revenue share agreements between these different infrastructure players where they share in those economics together. And so that's one possible future that we think we're living into.
Thank you. Luke, from builder perspective, you must be thinking about this topic every day as you have to face investors, you have to run your own team, you have to think about the CapEx for the next step growth. So could you share more from your past experience in building these projects?
Yeah, I think, business models in Web3 are still very new. That's the thing. Sequencer fees have been pretty sweet. Technically, I think Chakra supposedly captures some of that as settlement, but as Ed has also mentioned, kind of the primary, at least what investors want, isn't the sequencer fee. So so that's that. But that being said, I do think that every cycle we see 90% of the projects dying, right? And then they become zero. And so the projects that actually persist, they have strong revenue, right? Like Arbitrum always had strong performance in terms of the actual product. So we do try to build for something that's sustainably valuable. And sequencer fees, it's definitely something we're thinking about to focusing on. But as Ed has also mentioned, it's generally better in the industry, at least for the community, to decentralize that. And when you decentralize it, well, you as the company building the node software don't really capture that sequencer value anymore. So I think what's slightly more better for companies is to actually still have a protocol that offers unique value. Because supposedly then you capture that protocol value with your token, and that token isn't really, just a meme token, right? It has some fundamentals. People need it to use the protocol, and ideally it should be unique, because otherwise, if it's just like, say, a simple gas fee protocol that does whatever 3 or 4 other chains do, then there's really no motivation to use that protocol. So now that being said, for like shared sequencers and whatnot, people still haven't figured out that that particular layer yet, like say Espresso and whatnot. Those guys are out there. I think they're also prototyping a few models. So I think there's a lot of fast prototyping going on, but personally I think what's important is to capture value at a network with some valuable kind of a protocol. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing. As we are towards the end of the session, I think I would like to invite each of the panelists to comment on, a bit forward-looking, because we are in the bull market cycle, and the next 12 to 18 months is extremely more important. So from the project perspective, Taylor and Luke, what will be your key focus for the next 12 to 18 months? And then Ed, if you could close up with a final remark from the investor perspective, what do you think will be your key focus for Hack VC in the industry? Thanks.
Yeah, so I'll start this one off. Obviously at Dappos, we were fortunate enough in the past week to release the news that we received 15 million in funding from Polychain at a $300 million valuation. So I think as a project, once you reach a milestone like that, at that point, it's like, how can we build from here? And me as community, head of community, over the years, I've understood that like the community is actually the backbone of the project. Without a community, without the loyalty, without the longevity of your users, like what is the longevity of your project? So obviously we're going to continue to grow and build our community now that we've taken that next step forward, as well as our collaborations, because like I mentioned, the bread and butter of our project is with our collaborations, GMX, Banky, Perpetual, these DEXs and dApps. And I think over this past week, I've been able to meet with and, a lot of different projects, for example, like DPIN being one of the new buzzwords this week. I've seen a lot of value in that, as well as GameFi. And so I think at Dappos, we really want to figure out how to, as long as the tech works out, we're going to continue to collaborate and integrate with more and more projects to where we can help them onboard more users to their Dapper DEX. In return, they bring us more users. So it's all about user experience. It's all about, not everyone living up in this Web3 world that's not accessible for Web2 users. We've got to figure out how to bridge that gap. And one way to do that is simplifying everything and giving more people more opportunity to enter this industry. So,
thank you, Luke.
Yeah, so I guess for us, the really key part is that we really want to help app chains and abstract away the complexity of having to deal with block building, sequencing, and then the ZK proofs to prove that and whatnot. That's why we try to abstract away this settlement layer. We have a lot of focus in the next few months on deploying towards Bitcoin. This is because of what we've learned from users, what users feel they want currently and feel is missing. So later on, maybe we'll also deploy more towards Ethereum too, but there's also people working on that. So really, what we want to serve for our customers is, for like say DEXs. Personally, we see a lot of need for DEXs for customized app chains, and then also like for games, they might need like customized finality or whatnot in terms of their execution. And so we try to abstract away the parts that aren't really related to that to put in more towards like the block building and then sequencing kind of ZK proving part. Taking that away and having that as one layer so that people can have their unique execution layers and then settle either towards Bitcoin or some other environment. So that's how we try to serve the industry tentatively in the next 12 months, and it should be exciting.
Yeah, and so just to close things out, the way we think about the future going forward here is there's going to be a bifurcation among customers. So what I mean by that is, if you kind of look at the history of Web3, we used the example of CryptoKitties earlier. They evaluated probably a dozen different layer 1 protocols, and they just decided to build their own in the end, right? Because they were big enough they could do that, right? And that's not the first time that's happened, right? You look at the team, at Consensus, right, who built the Linnea protocol. And then, you kind of look at what happened at Coinbase, right, building the base chain, right? So we think there's like this weird adverse selection problem that happens sometimes in Web3, where the biggest and most valuable customers just kind of like roll their own stack, right? And build their own kind of open source stack that's customized to their needs. which means that the absolutely most valuable customers might just go for their own block space, basically. And what's interesting about going for your own block space is that you don't have to compete with other customers for attention, right? Like you kind of own that chain, it's yours, basically. And if you look at the roll-up as a service providers like Gelato or AltLayer, who's here today, they're kind of delivering on that to customers. They're giving customers their own roll-up as a service platform, right? That's specifically for them. And what's interesting about those vendors is that they basically control the customer relationship, right? They own that customer, and that's a powerful position to be in when you own that customer relationship, because you are the touch point for that customer who is addressing their needs. So we think that value may accrue to that layer because whoever controls the customer relationship accrues a lot of value naturally, basically. So we think there's going to be a bifurcation in the market where the very top end, absolutely most valuable customers might roll their own stacks. And then for the remaining customers, they're going to go for shared networks, things like shared sequencers, and roll up as a service solutions that are customized to their needs.
Thank you. I think one common point all three of you have shared is building an infrastructure that's based on end users' demand and needs, hearing what they want and building the best infrastructure in an optimal way that can drive the end user market. So thank you so much for sharing that. With that, we'll close this panel, and thank you again for three distinguished panelists sharing thoughts from investor and from builder's perspective. Thank you so much, and thanks for the audience listening.